All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event hosted by irishborderpoll.com. My name is Ella Whelan. I'm a journalist and an author, and I run the Battle of Ideas Festival with the Academy of Ideas, which is an annual politics, culture, technology, sport, and all sorts kind of a festival. I'm really delighted to have been asked to help Irish Border Poll put on this debate and introduce tonight's discussion. I'm also delighted that we have 87 people now in the room with us and pushing up towards 100, so that's brilliant. Not to blow our own trumpet, but shows that we've hit on a good debate. So welcome to irishborderpoll.com. It's less than a year old, and we've had several debates now on the constitutional question. You can find them all on YouTube. We're developing a library of resources of some of the speeches and debates that have taken place in relation to irishborderpoll.com. You can subscribe and follow us. Previous speakers have included Peter Cardwell, Colin Harvey, Pete Ramsey, Gawain Towler, Slugger O'Toole, and Andre Murphy. irishborderpoll.com is a UK group set up to campaign for an Irish border poll on Irish unity. And we're really keen to have anyone be involved, particularly those of you over here in the UK who want to get in touch. You can just head to the website, speak to Kevin Rooney or myself after the debate and find out how you can get involved. So tonight's discussion, titled, Do Pro-United Islanders Live in Never Never Land, or is Irish Unification Inevitable? Is, I think, a very timely, we always say it's timely discussions, but this one's particularly timely because it's based on several things that all of our speakers have contributed to public discussion in newspapers and print and elsewhere over the last few weeks. I'm certainly going to use it. After tonight's discussion, I'm writing an article on the anniversary of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, so I'm going to be plagiarizing and making notes and all sorts tonight, so really looking forward to it. I'm going to introduce the speakers and our chair, and then after a few technical points, I'll hand over. So first of all, we have Ruth Dudley Edwards. Hello, Ruth. Ruth is a freelance writer. She's been a freelance writer since 1979, writing for all sorts of places on all sorts of things. She's a historian and a prize-winning biographer. And most pertinently for tonight's discussion, Ruth wrote an article in the Belfast Newsletter titled "The Pro-United Ireland Activists Live in Never Never Land." Do you see the connection to the title now? Which has part inspired tonight's debate. So really looking forward to hearing Ruth expand on her views on that. Next up, we have Kevin Meagher. Hello, Kevin, is an author and commentator who is releasing a fully updated copy of his book, A United Ireland, Why Unification is Inevitable and How It Will Come About. There you go, there's the second part of tonight's debate, and that book is coming out later this month. In fact, is it next week, Kevin? It's very soon anyway. Yes, and well, we'll look and people should get a copy of that if they like to. I'm sure Kevin will put details in the chat about where you can pick it up. And then last but not least, there's Professor Jonathan Tonge, hello, John, who is of Liverpool University. There you are, where he teaches British and Irish politics, and very kindly and interestingly wrote a brilliant promo for tonight's debate in the Belfast Telegraph entitled "Northern Ireland Will Never Be Truly Secure, but a United Ireland Isn't Inevitable," which is most definitely worth a read. Whatever side you find yourself on at the start of this debate tonight, definitely go and check that out. That's our speakers. And then tonight's discussion is going to be chaired by Kevin Rooney, who is an author and a teacher, and he is the founder and chief organizer behind irishborderpoll.com. Kevin's the man who puts up all the stuff on the website, who's been doing a huge amount of organizing for a UK response to an Irish border poll. And Kevin's going to be running tonight's debate. So just a few points on format. Each speaker will speak for between 7 to 10 minutes, and they will be cut off. Speakers, be warned, you'll be cut off after 10 minutes because we want to run tight to time. We're thinking that the debate will end at about 8:15. If it's going full barrel, then we'll keep it going until 8:30. But most definitely, any of you waiting to keep dinner warm in the oven, it will be cut off time at 8:30. So that's our absolute limit. After the speakers have given their introductory thoughts, Kevin is going to ask a few questions, but then it is over to all of you in the audience. And please don't be shy, ask questions, but as much as myself and Kevin Rooney are for free speech and want this to be an open platform, my patience runs thin with abuse and offensive language, so be warned and be forescolded. We won't tolerate any of that, but most definitely raise points, raise criticisms, ask questions, use that chat function for whatever you like. It's important to note that sometimes in debates, people raise their hand and ask questions. In this one, I'm going to be chairing the questions, which means that you should put any questions you have to our speakers or to Kevin, or points that you want raised, into the chat. You just use that by typing it in. Just be warned, everyone can see it. And if you want to send me something privately, you just send it to Ella Whelan, but it is public. And I'll be reading out those questions as Kevin comes back to me throughout the debate. If just a final few points, if you want to hear, if you want to just remind you to subscribe to Irish Border Poll. If you live in Britain, we would definitely want to hear from you and get involved. There's also, if you are across the water, an event coming up on Saturday, which I've been asked to announce, hosted by Ireland's Future in Derry, which is called Preparing for United Ireland, and that's at 1 o'clock. And feel free to go to the website to find out more details to that. Just one last thing to say thank you to Harley Richardson, whose man you heard from at the stop, who's going to be in the background pulling levers, pushing buttons. And if you have any technical issues throughout this, if the sound goes or something like that, send a message to myself or Harley and we'll try and help you out. I think that just about covers it. So, do pro-United Islanders live in Never Never Land, or is Irish unification inevitable? I'll hand you now over to Kevin Rooney, our chair.
Thanks, Ella. So hopefully you can all hear me. Let's get stuck straight in. The plan of action is Ruth will speak first for 7 minutes. Second, we'll go with Kevin, 7 minutes. And last, we'll go with John. And after that, I might ask maybe a question or two, and we'll get stuck into debate. So without further ado, Ruth, kick us off, please.
Well, good evening, everyone. Very nice to be here. Forgive me if I'm a bit croaky. It's no sinister disease. It's called the common cold. I'm not going to use my articles on this particularly. I want to put in a few random thoughts, except that I will start with something about the polls because they're relevant to my first story. My first story is a taxi driver in Dublin. Taxi drivers, as we know, are always very wise. And it was around the time of the Queen's visit to Ireland, if I remember correctly. And there was something on the taxi radio about United Ireland. And I said to him, how do you feel about a United Ireland? And he said, I don't care, he said, if they make us have it, as long as it has no effect whatsoever on the 26 counties. And I think that was absolutely what the last polls, the interesting polls a few weeks ago showed, is the absolute truth of it, and is certainly what I've always gathered from people in Ireland, in the south. Fine if it makes no difference. And there was this extraordinary poll, in-depth poll, Irish Times, Ipsos, last month, in which they really asked the important questions. I mean, they said, do you want United Ireland? And of course, everybody always says yes in the South, or most people do. But they were asked, is it very important? Is it a priority to you? 20% regarded a United Ireland as very important and a priority. 20%, that went up to 36% of Sinn Féin. 24% thought it wasn't that important. 52% said it wasn't very important, but would like to see it someday. And that was also the position of 47% of Sinn Féin voters. So as I watch all these intense people, I'm not trying to be offensive in any way, who are obsessed with the notion of a border poll and United Ireland soon, I think of these sort of figures, and I think of the taxi driver. They also were asked what concessions they would make to make United Ireland more possible. 77% of people wouldn't consider a new flag. 72% wouldn't consider a new anthem. 71% would not accept rejoining the Commonwealth. And even larger numbers would consider higher taxes or less money. That was summed up rather beautifully by the Irish Times, Pat Leahy, who said, as he saw the results of this poll, it was, so you want a United Ireland? You ask the people. Of course. Soon, not really. Want to pay for it? Nope. Want to change the anthem or the flag? Not a chance. How much do you really care about it? Let me get back to you on that. I have found it very frustrating. I live in London. I was brought up and educated in Dublin, and I am very close to an awful lot of people in Northern Ireland and go there when there isn't any COVID around stopping me. And what I began to learn as I got stuck into that was the unbelievable ignorance in the South about Northern Ireland and the condescension. And I mean, I want to give you a short story from being at a British-Irish Association event in the late 90s. And I had persuaded, I was on the committee, I had persuaded both the committee and individuals to have Orange men present. I had made friends with Orange men. I was writing a book about them. And they threw themselves into it, trying to get to know people they wouldn't normally meet. And I was in the bar with 2 Orange men, and a third friend of all of ours came up and said in a despairing sort of a way, I spent an hour last night explaining, and I won't give the names, X and Y, who were 2 very sophisticated members of the Dáil Éireann, explaining to them why I'm an Orange man. One of them has just bounced over to me and said, we've been talking about you, and we've all decided you can't be an Orange man. You're too nice. To which the second Orange man replied, I was in Dublin a while ago when someone in the group I was with who knew me quite well said, why don't you tell those awful Orange men to stop those parades? When I explained I was an Orange man, they all said, you're not. I said, I am. And they said, you're not. But I am. You're not, you're not, you're not. So I said, okay, have it your way. Obviously, when I think I parade through Belfast in a Colorado on the 12th of July, I'm suffering from delusions. And the third Orange man, who had always believed the Southern Irish mind was so closed, it was a waste of time trying to explain anything, said, there you are. What did I tell you? And this is really very important, because the notion of uniting with people you know nothing, virtually nothing about, was extraordinary. I got to know Northern Ireland extremely well, and I spent a great deal of time with ordinary unionists, because the background I'd come from was nationalists. This is the one that I wanted to get to understand.
Ruth, that's you hitting 7 minutes now. So if you...
Oh, good Lord. Okay. Well, then I'm going to speed on. The ignorance was almost total, and no curiosity, absolutely no curiosity. Just a feeling that they'd know when they got the chance, they'd love to join because our culture was much more fun than theirs. That was the general aspect of it. Well, I'm going to throw in one because I'm sure some of my friends here will talk about Brexit. I think you should know that I think Brexit has made it much less likely that there be a united Ireland. And somebody who summed it up terribly well on Twitter said the other day, if people thought Brexit was difficult, it would look like a picnic compared to getting agreement on a new Ireland. Ain't gonna happen. So for a whole lot of reasons, the ignorance of the Irish, the reluctance of the Southern Irish to be involved in it at all. Oh, and I should add the fact that Sinn Féin might go into power, and they are a cancer, and they make reunification impossible. That's it.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And without further ado, Kevin, we'll kick straight off with you. Give it your best shot. United Ireland, why do you think it's inevitable?
Good. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Do pro-United Islanders live in Never Never Land, or is Irish unification inevitable is the question. Now, I'm a bit rusty, but I seem to recall that Neverland was populated by boys who refused to grow up and a few crocodiles, which I have to say sounds a lot more like the DUP to me. Tonight's discussion, I think, boils down to this: who wears the clothes of the realist more convincingly, myself or Ruth? Let me start by saying that I don't approach the issue of Irish unity as an idealist. I'm a cynical political apparatchik, an ex-lobbyist, a former special advisor, spin doctor. Politically, I'm a disciple of realpolitik. I cast a jaundiced eye over the political scene. And if I didn't think that Irish unity was inevitable, then I wouldn't make that claim. Granted, at one time, the issue of Irish unity was mainly aspirational. As I often point out, the preserve of old men lilting the dying rebel in a backstreet pub. And unionists, of course, once thought of themselves as the realists, having settled the constitutional question by creating a state in their own image, by fair means or foul, and mostly foul as it turned out. But now, however, positions are reversed. United Islanders have the evidence-based arguments. the right response to what Disraeli referred to as the temper of the times. They are the pragmatists, the realists, the reasoned, the people in what Bill Clinton once memorably called the future business. And so there are two aspects, I think, to my case. The first is that the existing model, Northern Ireland, is simply unsustainable. The second is that there is a better alternative, a new single 32-county Irish state. The impacts of Brexit, the likelihood of Scottish independence, and centrifugal pressure for greater power and public money for Northern England makes Northern Ireland's position ever more anomalous in the United Kingdom. There are even stirrings, of course, of Welsh separatism. A poll last year put independence on 39%, while Mark Drakeford, the Labour First Minister for Wales, has made a formal pact with Plaid Cymru. Things are changing in Britain, let alone in Ireland. Meanwhile, the Irish state is irrevocably changed, no longer a plausible spectre to Ulster's Protestants. And then we have Brexit, which I suspect, as Ruth says, we'll talk quite a lot about tonight. Let me just say that it leaves Northern Ireland betwixt and between two worlds, and £600 million a year poorer. Will we lavish equivalent subsidies on hill farmers when we get a free trade deal with Australia and New Zealand? I doubt it, and so does Edwin Poots for that matter. Underpinned by all this is a pervasive British disinterest about keeping Northern Ireland a faraway place of which most Britons care and know little. While the Good Friday Agreement provides a clear guarantee of a vote on the constitutional question, with less and less road these days for British and Irish ministers to kick the can down. The Coalition for Irish Unity includes true believers, but also those who can live with constitutional change, who see the ancillary benefits, automatic re-entry to the EU and single market, guaranteed farm payments. The alternative model before us is to become part of a modern, successful, liberal Irish state, the fastest growing economy in the European Union, a self-confident nation that, as the Protocol Row has shown, has an abundance of soft power stretching from the Oval Office and the Security Council of the United Nations through to the Chancelleries of Europe, a country with the second highest quality of life in the world, according to the UN, and a health service equivalent in global rankings to the National Health Service, albeit one where Southern Irish men and women live on average 2 years longer than those in the North. A hinterland then that will help provide the goodwill and finance to make a success of Irish unity. Unionists, on the other hand, are left defending a failing status quo. And like the band of the same name, theirs is a three-chord politics, blasting out tired numbers to a declining audience. They cannot dictate terms any longer. In 2017, in the 2017 Assembly elections, Sinn Féin was just 1,100 first preference votes behind the DUP, and the gap between parties on the constitutional question was as close as 30,000 votes. While United Irelanders look south with confidence about the future, Unionists instead peer across to a Britain they barely recognise, a country that pays them little heed, to a Westminster class that has, in turn, ignored them when it could, charmed them when it needed, promised them when it was expedient, and betrayed them as it pleased. Churchill, of course, tried to offload Northern Ireland to De Valera in return for Irish support in the Second World War. Harold Wilson had a 15-year plan to bring about Irish unity in the 70s. Margaret Thatcher signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, giving Dublin a say in the affairs of the North. John Major signed the Downing Street Declaration, cementing that joint all-Ireland approach. Tony Blair delivered the Good Friday Agreement, hardwiring a referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional future into the deal. And then we have Boris Johnson. He promised Unionists a bridge, then a tunnel, but all they got was a lousy border in the Irish Sea. When will they take the hint? They are losing ground and they must know it, but whose fault is that? The future's bright, the future's orange, quipped Ian Paisley as the DUP's deal to prop up Theresa May's government was agreed back in 2017. A defunct marketing slogan from a company that had ceased to exist, swallowed up by a rival. The DUP's hubris, its casual bigotry, the inability to self-reflect or to come to terms with past failings, never mind its basic unwillingness to reach out, is only exceeded by its strategic incompetence. Geoffrey Donaldson says we should not even talk about Irish unity. Others say unionists are not emotionally ready for the conversation. Arlene Foster, of course, promised to leave Ireland if it ever came about. Like the Lost Boys in Neverland, when will they grow up? If Northern Ireland is to be sustained, then the numbers that support it, or are at least comfortable with it, needs to increase. Peter Robinson spelt that out to the DUP conference a decade ago. Make peace with modernity, embrace power sharing in a genuine way, concede the point on cultural respect issues like an Irish Language Act, create a consensus for inaction. But who will make that reasoned and reasonably expressed argument? The DUP, the original nasty party, the TUV, a microwaved version of the DUP, piping hot in the middle with political bile, the UUP, It would like to see itself as a modernising face of unionism, but its leader, Doug Beattie, an affable, interesting and very courageous man in his previous service. But he lacks the imagination or political flair to move beyond the lager, and cannot even bring himself to conceive that he would serve under a Sinn Féin First Minister. Then
7
there are the
minutes
loyalists.
gone, Kevin. You still got another 3 if you need them.
Sure. Then there are the loyalists, muttering darkly from their lofty perch atop the nearest wheelie bin, while corner boys rip up copies of the Good Friday Agreement. Unionism is in crisis, but one entirely of its own making. Ultimately, Northern Ireland was not built to last, and so it has never worked, does not work, and will never work. There is no golden age to look back on, no normal to return to. It has been a 50, 30, 20 century, 5 decades of miserable sectarian misrule by unionists, 3 decades of awful internecine violence, and 20 years of stop-start politics. Ironically, this is the best that Northern Ireland has ever been governed and is ever likely to be governed. A grisly thought, perhaps, but there is a better way. Alignment with one of the most dynamic economies in the world, meaningful devolution of power to cities and towns right across Ireland, constitutionally assured civil and cultural rights, an all-Ireland healthcare system free at the point of need, a new country cognizant of its traumatic past, but no longer beholden to it. As one model limps into its 2nd century, another model begins to take shape. While unionists, like Peter Pan, hope the status quo will prevail if they believe hard enough, United Islanders are in the future business, making the case, building momentum, and winning the argument. Thank you.
Brilliant, Kevin. So you've led your stall out really well there. Ruth led her stall out. So let's go for John Tonge. John, what do you make of this? So United Ireland, who's the dreamers? Who's lived in Never Never Land? Who's the realist? On you go, John.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks very much, Ella. Thanks very much, Harvey. Thanks to all the organisers. Great debate, and thanks to Ruth and Kevin for putting their propositions. I have the luxury of disagreeing with both of them. First of all, in terms of whether a United Ireland is Never Never Land, it cannot be Never Never Land, because Ruth talked about the people being obsessed with the United Ireland when others didn't really care. But frankly, the party that is obsessed with the United Ireland is heading for government inexorably in the south. No matter how much Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael try and exclude Sinn Féin, at some point Sinn Féin will be in government in the south. Hands up all those who think that that will make talk of United Ireland disappear. Me neither. Sinn Féin is heading probably for the first ministership in the north. And again, as the majority party in the north, albeit not with an overall majority, of course, it's not a majoritarian system. Again, who seriously thinks that that will make talk of a United Ireland and debate about a United Ireland disappear? No one can seriously, possibly think that. But that does not make a United Ireland inevitable. And it's not just me who says that. The president of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald, uttered those very words here at the University of Liverpool only 4 years ago, when she was asked the question, not by me, about whether a United Ireland was inevitable. And so if the president of Sinn Féin doesn't think it's inevitable, then again, that's where I would disagree with Kevin about the inevitability of this. There's a strong likelihood of it, but nothing in politics is inevitable. You've got to remember what the Republican movement, the vast bulk of the Republican movement, signed up to in 1998. Very tough rules of the game, because with abstention and then the IRA's armed campaign having failed to yield the United Ireland, Republicans were obliged to sign up to some really tough rules that in effect recognised the northern state, recognised the principle of consent within a northern state that they'd always rejected, and signed up to that consent principle being predicated upon it being at the whim of a British Secretary of State as to when to call a border poll. And people have tried to fix the criteria for that border poll, or at least get clarification over what the criteria for that border poll should be. Colin Harvey is one of those people, Colin Harvey at Queen's, who's tried to get that, but those efforts have fallen on stony ground. Mr. Justice Girvan said that it was completely wrong to impose fixed criteria upon the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and the Secretary of State won't be calling a border poll anytime soon. He or she will call a border poll when they think that majority opinion in the north has shifted in favour of a United Ireland. We're still some way away from that, and those are the rules of the game. And it wouldn't matter if there was a 100% majority in the south in favour of United Ireland. The rules of the game that were signed up to in 1998 are that you need northern consent as well. And that's very, very difficult, but not impossible by any means for Republicans to obtain. Let's have a look at the survey evidence that we've got. We've had, every poll produces arguments because of different methodology. So online surveys show greater support for United Ireland, the sort of surveys that are done by Lucid Talk. University of Liverpool post-election surveys are done face-to-face. Critics of those say, well, people are reluctant to show support for United Ireland face-to-face to an interviewer because of the history of the Northern State and because it was once upon a time a taboo. Online polls are criticised for being self-enrolling and that supporters of a particular political party or cause can sign up to them. And then you've got the Northern Ireland Life and Times surveys, which have been criticised for underweighting Sinn Féin support. Now, we can debate the legitimacy of those criticisms, but if we merge all those polls together and do a poll of polls, what do we see? We see significant support for United Ireland, averaged out at 35%, but support for the Union at 48%. So United Ireland is certainly not Never Never Land on those figures. It's 13% shy of where it needs to be. 48% averaging support for the Union, 35% for a United Ireland. And you see, because those figures don't add up to anything near 100%, you see that there's a lot of people out there who are don't knows. There is an increasing amount of constitutional agnosticism, and that is coming out in whatever surveys are being used here. Reflected, for example, in a bigger vote for the Alliance Party, which once upon a time could have been just called a soft U, small U unionist party, but now whose support base is not necessarily overwhelmingly in favour of the maintenance of the Union, but nor is it massively in favour by any means of a United Ireland. It's not as if, I mean, one of the big myths about the Brexit vote, well, I don't agree with Ruth that Brexit made a United Ireland less likely, but it didn't make a United Ireland that more likely in a way that people might have envisaged, because people who didn't want Brexit within unionism, people like Mike Nesbitt or Doug Beattie, the leader of the UUP, they didn't wake up the following morning and be so disgusted with the Brexit vote that it made them nationalists wanting United Ireland. Republicans are not converting unionists to the cause of Irish unity, but Republicans can and may convert those constitutional agnostics, those younger people who do not wake up every morning, who are exercised by the constitutional question, who are not particularly wedded to Northern Ireland being the United Kingdom, but do need persuading in favour of the merits of Irish unity, a debate that will be won, if it is to be won, around issues like the health service, around issues around certain social issues, and around the economy. So those are the key issues. What I would agree with Kevin is that some of the old flag waving and some of the old unionist rallying cries are of diminished salience these days. They're not working amongst a section of what you might call the Protestant community in a way that once would have been the case. And that will probably be reflected in the forthcoming assembly election. So,
John, you've got one more minute.
Okay. So my message to finish off is there's all to play for. It's not Never Never Land to talk about United Ireland. It may well happen. I'd still be sceptical whether it happens in my lifetime, but it might do. It's probable in the long term, although as Keynes famously said, in the long term, but we are all dead. If there was a border poll in the next 5 years, I'd bet anyone on logging into this tonight, £100, take me on if you want, that Northern Ireland would vote to remain in the United Kingdom. But I wouldn't be betting on any such vote if you had it in 2 decades' time. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
John, thank you very, very much. And thanks to my 3 speakers. John, I'm going to ask the Anorak question first, and apologies to all the people watching and listening, because some of you might find this boring, but to other people, it's really interesting. And you have to answer me very quickly and concisely, which is almost impossible task. Here are my questions. Number 1, how can you get such widely different polls, where 4 polls can say majority want United Ireland, nearly 20 say no, they want to stay part of the union? That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is about the methodologies themselves. University, Liverpool University, how can it come out with a poll saying X amount of people, majority want to be British, yet the weighting is such that there's far fewer Sinn Féin voters asked than should be in that particular poll. So how can you have such flawed methodologies? Now, I realise that this is a complicated question, and I'm asking you to do the impossible and give me a really concise answer if possible.
Okay, I'll be as brief and concise, hopefully, as I can be. Okay, there's different methods being used according to different polling organisations. Okay, the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey is the annual survey that is used, and that always underweights Sinn Féin's votes. Sinn Féin had Sinn Féin on only about 12% at the last survey that it did. So it massively, in my view, underreported support for United Ireland. So that's the Life and Times survey dealt with, the annual survey. Then there's the University of Liverpool post-election surveys. They're not to be confused with the survey that I think you're referring to, Kevin, which was undertaken, Pete Sherlow.
Yes, that one's the one I was referring to.
That used a different method. That did use online surveys, whereas the I've done the last 4 Northern Ireland general election surveys. We do it after the election. We ask people why they voted the way they did. Social Market Research Belfast do that. They go into voters' houses and ask how they voted the way they did. And they also ask non-voters. And that's one of the things about face-to-face surveys, because they're studies of the entire electorate, including that 1 in 3, those 1 in 3 people who didn't vote. And so you get a lot more don't knows. Lucid Talk is the main online pollster, as we know. The Lucid Talk and the normal University of Liverpool surveys that I've organised have come to the same findings on support for the union, Kevin, okay? They've all come around 50%. About half of Northern Ireland's electorate support the union. Where they've differed is in support for United Ireland. Lucid Talk finds a higher figure, somewhere in the about 43% on average. We've only got it at around 35, 36%. Why? Because Lucid Talk find fewer don't knows, because people who sign up to online polls tend to be politically committed and they'll vote anyway, whereas we're studying the electorate. Lucid Talk are looking at voters. That's part of the difference. Lucid Talk also take the view that people are shy still about saying they want United Ireland, and so they wouldn't tell a stranger who's interviewing them face to face that they wanted a United Ireland. I don't think that can be proved either way at this stage. It's a hypothesis, and it's probably something that we do need to look at.
Okay, John, brilliant. Look, Ella, I'm going to ask Kevin and Ruth the question, but can I check, Ella, are we getting questions coming in?
Yes, I have a few. So go ahead
brilliant.
And then come to me whenever.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ask a question to each of you guys, and if you can be really quick in your answers, I appreciate it. Kevin, I loved your speech. I'm convinced. but I'm a United Islander, so I would be convinced. My question to you, Kevin, is what do you say to John there when he talks about if you average out all the polls, there's a whopping gap at the moment, and the United Ireland camp is down well below the pro-union camp. So do you think that the polling is just wrong and flawed, or do you think that actually a lot of the arguments that you put forward will take a bit of time to kick in? And then let me ask the question to Ruth now, and Kevin, you can go first and Ruth can come after. Ruth, this is the question to you. When Kevin talks about Brexit, Scottish independence, economic sense to unite with the South, demographics for most young people favour United Ireland, a really self-confident civic nationalism where unionism seems inward-looking and exclusionary and seems to be making strategically the wrong moves, do you not think that you would be complacent to think that the signs are looking good for United Ireland? Anyway, that was a question to Ruth. Kevin, you go first. What have you got to say about John on his polls?
I think we've got a problem with the polling, and again, it's partly because Northern Ireland is, as I say, a faraway place of which we often know and care too little. But of course, there's not an awful lot of polling necessarily in Irish politics in the South either. Not compared to what we're used to in terms of Westminster polling, I guess. I mean, what strikes me as unusual, I mean, the poll of polls, I think, we're probably comparing apples and oranges a little bit, but the polls that show support, it's kind of support for unity at the kind of high 20s, very low 30s. I mean, for me, the problem is it doesn't pass the common sense test. The common sense test is that Sinn Féin is pulling 24-25% in actual votes. So the idea that you've only got another 4 or 5% of people who would favour United Ireland voting across all of the other parties just doesn't stack up for me. I mean, we look at the SDLP, where 9 out of 10 SDLP voters support Irish unity. A big chunk of Alliance Party supporters voting tactically support Irish unity, often to vote to keep unionists out. The Green Party, People Before Profit, you know, these are parties where, again, there is very high levels of support for Irish unity. So, I mean, I tend to intuit. I mean, I'm very careful about putting any faith in any polls as a general rule. I think those of us that came of a political age in 1992, where the pollsters got it completely wrong, again, often because of face-to-face polling and the spiral of silence and the reluctance and the inhibitions people have to give controversial views to pollsters in the street. I'm kind of scarred by that experience. So I take all these polls with kind of a pinch of salt. But for me, the common sense test suggests that if you add together Sinn Féin vote, SDLP vote, and some of this, and apportion a chunk of vote from some of the other smaller parties, then you start to get into the territory that we see in the Lucid Talk polls, which for me kind of feel right.
Dead on, Kevin. Ruth, any quick comments before I pass on to Ella, where she's going to fire out some questions from the audience?
Yes, and I'm going to behave like a politician and not answer the question you've asked me, but answer the question I think you should have asked me. But when I'll touch on it, I may just say for a start that I don't think there's a cat and hell's chance of Scottish independence being voted for. Who wants a land border of the length that would be? What a nightmare between the EU and the UK. Forget it, it's not going to happen. However, I want to give you one quote. A friend of mine, Irish nationalist. We were having a discussion the other day and he said, with all its faults, he said, I'm happy with the country we've built in the Republic and I don't want it threatened. I'm a partitionist. And I think you completely underestimate how many people want stability above all and how much Sinn Féin are threatening it. What the elephant is not being mentioned is the terrorist elephant. For any unionist and large numbers of constitutional nationalists, they not only remember the horrors of what was done to them by the IRA and the loyalist paramilitaries. It is the last thing they want to do is to risk any kind of instability again. And with Sinn Féin, the problem is that they all the time honor their murderers. And that means that there's no chance of this going away. And human nature is such. So there is no chance of it going away, while Michelle O'Neill is leading yet another parade to honor some fellow who blew himself up with a bomb and a few prods with him. It's not going, the rejection will be total. Just to put it in a sentence, I think there could well have been a united Ireland a very long time ago if there had been no physical forced violence. But it's the very fact of the violence that has made it impossible. And the worst enemies of a united Ireland, possibility of it, are the people who honor IRA murderers, which is the Sinn Féin party.
Okay, but Ruth, give me a 10-second, 5-second answer to this. So we're about 20 years or more, whatever, since the violence stopped. So the logic of your position is that we will have a united Ireland after a while because the violence will have stopped long enough. And also, are you telling me that if according to you, if Michelle O'Neill stopped honouring the IRA volunteers tomorrow morning, that in a brief period we would have a united Ireland thereafter?
I don't think there's the faintest chance of it unless Sinn Féin apologise, and they'll never do that. And as long as they are being run by remnants of the IRA Army Council in Belfast, which the security forces say they are, there isn't a chance.
Okay,
it's not the violence stopping. It's
on,
the fact that they.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm trying to nail it down. I know the audience can ask what they want, Al. I'm about to go to you. I'm trying to nail it down a little bit, though, about who's the realist in this discussion, who's the dreamers. That's really where I'm at in terms of what's the possibility of the potential for United Ireland. So, Ella, over to you. I can't see the questions, so you're the boss now. Ella, find some questions out.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, yeah, we've got a good number of questions coming in and people are using the chat function. Just a note, if anyone's getting annoyed by the chat, you can minimize it. So just press that little arrow and it won't annoy you any longer. But there's a healthy amount of commentary going on. So Austin, to begin with one that just reflect off of what Ruth's just said there. Tony mentioned in the chat that he thinks that Northern Ireland is more likely to be a shared space, what he calls a hatched area between the UK and the rest of Ireland, that it's, for it to be pitched into a new status overnight, he says would most likely see violence erupt again, and that you need a transition period of a Y number of years. So I suppose a question to the panelists about whether or not, picking up on what Ruth has just said about the prospect of violence, how that plays into contemporary discussions. I have Joseph, who raises a point about a completely other issue that says that actually, rather than being in the past, there are some contemporary issues relating to the republic that need to be addressed, that a new republic must, he says, have new laws and different identities, and that a major barrier to reunification is the lack of a free health service in the republic. He says that you need something like the NHS, and how do those sort of practical, not just practical, but, you know, serious issues of things like healthcare, new laws, not just flags, but a kind of, you know, very contemporary issues be dealt with in the question of Irish unification. I'll just give you two more. Andrew says that he recalls reading somewhere that there is not much difference between the percentage in the 70s border poll and that if it would be held tomorrow. And he says this is probably goes to your desire to get down to who are the realists and who are living in the past, Kevin. 50 years on, you know, what is it that would change things? Is it talking about issues like healthcare and things like that? Or is it, what is the balance between addressing the past and addressing the future that could help move this debate on? And then just one more, I have lots, so you can come back to me, but one more for this round. Dennis poses a question, and I think this is mainly to Ruth. In the Irish Republic, there's great debate about questions of gender, of racial and economic equality. What is the basis for Unionist rejection of being part of a modern Ireland? He says that Unionism rejects the South and its culture because they consider the people of the South to be inferior. And he asks, what else is Orangism other than that? So I'll leave it at that and come back to me anytime you like.
Ella, that's brilliant. And I'm going to be the boss and I'm going to be a dictator. And Kevin, I want you to come in on this healthcare question, because an awful lot of people who are very predisposed to United Ireland even will always raise the healthcare question. So how would you come back to that? The difference between the border poll sort of figures now in the 1970s, John, I want you to pick that one up, because I note that you say since Brexit, the percentage for United Ireland has increased by about 10% or more. And then Ruth, you can take the last question that Ella just mentioned. And guys, I know it's hard, but if you can all be relatively concise, if you're dying to pick up any other questions, you can, but I'm conscious to go back to Ella and pull out some more people's comments and questions. So Kevin, kicking off with you, healthcare.
I think it's a central question, clearly. I mean, it's a question that exercises the parties in the South in terms of the kind of insurance-based system that they run down there. As I say, in terms of global rankings of healthcare systems, the Irish system usually just pips the NHS, and that changed hands last year. So they're pretty equivalent in terms of the quality of the service that they've got, but of course the funding model is very different. Of course, taxes are of course much lower in the South than they are in the North. But I think the interesting issue is that some unionists say, look, you know, you'll swamp Northern Ireland, and we're just an adjunct that's bolted onto the kind of the southern state. And you know, I mean, somebody mentioned Mary Lou McDonald before. I mean, she's been very clear that that's not the case at all. This has got to be a reimagined new state from the bottom up, and lots of things are on the table, including some of the cultural stuff and the symbols and all the rest of it, which for me is just personally a dead end conversation, flags and anthems and all the rest of it. I think what is interesting are two things. One is new public services, and one is executive political office. And what I mean by that, just very briefly, is that there should be the British NHS model should be incorporated in a new single Irish state. And I think there's very broad support for that down south. But I think there's also other things that can be incorporated as well. And I think it gets us around some of the knotty problems we've got with, for example, does Stormont remain? For me, it's a zombie parliament on a good day. The idea that you would keep Northern Ireland at Stormont running in a unitary island, which is, it's an hour away from Dublin, in a country with 6.5 million people, is absolutely barking mad. I mean, sell it off as a conference venue, frankly. But what we should see is the incorporation of, I think the Metro Mayor model would be very interesting in a new all-island 32-county state. And I think Ireland's flirted with this. There were referendums a couple of years ago in Waterford and Cork where it didn't quite catch on. But I think the idea of having strong, autonomous executive political leadership in communities across the north and across the whole of Ireland will be of immense value, and it would be something that it would be a British idea that would be brought into Ireland. I think it would improve governance in the south, as of course a health service would as well. But it would also give meaningful political office to unionists in the north as well, rather than just keeping as I say, a zombie parliament.
Thanks, Kevin. Sorry to have to stop you. Sorry. Just on the question about a health service, Ella, whoever that came from, Ireland's future, which most people know, some people in Britain might not know of. I think they're shortly about to produce a paper on the question of a health service in All Ireland. So look out for that when it comes. John, quickly, if you can, for us, the figures in the 70s compared to today, what are we looking like? Has the border poll figures changed much?
Well, yeah, there's greater support for Irish unity now. Not so much in the south. The support for unity has always been there in the south. I mean, Ruth fairly made the point, that support for unity may be soft, where if there's a price to be paid for unity, but it's still there. And the fact that 100 years after the formation of the northern state, you've still got that strong aspiration for Irish unity on the island of Ireland as a whole, I think is important. In terms of how much Brexit has changed that dial. Again, there's conflicting polls. I mean, Lord Ashcroft did his poll a couple of years ago, and that showed that he claimed there was majority support for United Ireland in Northern Ireland. But when he came back and did it last year, he found that support for United Ireland actually dropped in Northern Ireland. It was 8% behind support for the Union. So there's an example of this, Brexit, the effects of Brexit being unclear at present. But I think in the longer term, what you've got to look at, and where the polls agree right across the board, is where younger people are heading. Okay, younger people are much more likely to vote Sinn Féin. Now, it's partly because of the legacy, obviously, of Sinn Féin and IRA violence. Okay, but younger, those from a nationalist background, massively in favour of Sinn Féin these days. So Sinn Féin are not going to disappear. They're heading, like I said, for the first ministership. That will gain, it might only be of symbolic importance, given that it's a joint post with Deputy First Minister, but the symbolic importance, I think, of Sinn Féin in government as they're heading to south of the border, and as Michelle O'Neill, the likely First Minister, come May. You can't underestimate the symbolic importance of that. Just one last point, though, is that to say that doesn't mean that nationalism is growing overall, though, either. Unionism is diminishing faster than is nationalism. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement, the unionist bloc, total bloc, all unionist parties, was half the vote. Okay, now it's down to low 40s. But the nationalist bloc, the total number of people voting for nationalist parties, is pretty static. Okay, the growth has been of the sort of indeterminate centre ground, and it's those people that need to be won over. There are some signs that the United Ireland campaign is winning younger non-unionist and non-nationalists over, but Republicans need to win a lot more of them to get over the line.
Thanks, John. And Ruth, over to you for any quick point before we go back to Ella.
We are certainly not short of moving parts in all this. And one of the moving parts is that if unionists have the sense to recognise it, and all the people of Northern Ireland have, they could become extraordinarily prosperous by using the protocol. And I think quite a few businesses are already realizing that they are in a unique position to prosper with access, utter free and complete access to the EU and the UK, which no other entity will have. And the point is that Northern Ireland could be in a position that nobody would want to abandon. The point about the culture, no, it's not that Northern Ireland prods look down on Irish culture. It is that they have had their own culture under attack solidly for decades. They have had a whole campaign, again from Sinn Féin, saying that they had no culture. They have been, the hatred that they just encounter every day on Twitter is quite astonishing. it doesn't come the other way in the same way at all. There are pockets of hatred and loyalism. It is not the case. But what will ensure that there is no pull towards any kind of unity will be if unionists feel that the people who murdered them are still controlling the political party who aspires to run them. I think Sinn Féin are a cancer, and I think in the end they are not going to survive as a party. They'll probably take over Fianna Fáil or something. I suppose they will. But I don't think they're going to win friends. I don't think they're going to be any good at it. They've no experience in government. You know, these are all the moving parts. If Sinn Féin do make it into power in the south, and will they? Because the two big parties are still hate them. I don't know. So none of us can predict anything. We don't know what the hell will be happening in 3 years' time, let alone 10. But I will say that as long as any people who run a political party still believe that it's right to say that the murders were right, as long as you have that going on, there is no chance of any kind of friendship, let alone unity. We can't ignore this.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And absolutely free speech is allowed here. So fair play, Ruth. You had made that point about Republicans in the area a few times, and that's great. Guys, anybody,
because nobody else does.
No problem. I'm hoping that we don't get sucked into the reeds of identity politics too much tonight. Let's say what you want. I have a few more questions, Ella, but I'm going to be a Democrat and defer to the audience. So Ella, spit out a couple more questions and comments from people, and we'll pick them up and run with them.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. So we have one from Patrick, who says that many will not commit to unity without substance on the table. This is sort of picking up on the thread from the NHS, but more broadly, he asks, did the panelists agree that more people would, including economic unionism, would engage with the Citizens' Assembly or a constitutional conference or some kind of, similar things that we've seen, for example, in the South in relation to the referendum on repealing the 8th Amendment, those kind of formats of democratic engagement, which go heavy on the information sharing, would something like that, to put a bit of substance on the table, change the nature of the debate around the future of Irish unification or a border poll? Just sticking with polls, Fraser asked a question and made a point that actually I've been thinking about as well, which is that surely, and John and other people have mentioned it, after 1992, but more recently after Brexit, and definitely some general elections in the UK recently, the idea of polling being trustworthy, or indeed over in America with Trump, that the preconceived ideas of how things are going to play out continuously are getting smashed. Populists are far more unpredictable these days. And so wouldn't that change the nature of, or would it actually, this is me adding on to Fraser, would it actually mean that it's more fair to have a border poll? Because if, as Ruth says, you just don't know what's going to happen in 3-10 years, then why not throw the question out there and see what happens? Just two more very quickly. Eugene asked a really interesting question about the nature of changing demographics, about the hollowing out of middle-class unionism. Eugene makes a point that lots of unionists their children tend to go to universities in Britain, and then they stay there, they work here, they live here, which is not, as he says, a similar trend that happens in nationalist communities who tend to stay put. And so is there a kind of, I don't know that you'd call it brain drain, but that kind of demographic shift that happens with middle-class unionism that could affect any future question on a border poll? And then last one from Bernie, which is that she says that social questions would fade and issues of national sovereignty would inevitably come to the fore when it came to the crunch. And she asks whether or not, okay, we can talk about things like the NHS, and people have mentioned disability rights, by the way, a lot in the chat in both the North and the South. Things like that, wouldn't it be more important actually for both sides to face history? Is there a bit of history dodging here, and be open about that, and rather than living in the past, actually embrace the fact that the past is still very relevant for people today? I'll leave it there. That's more.
Wow, they're friggin' brilliant questions. And guys, we can't take them all. We'll be here all night. So take what you want, but I'm going to suggest what you should do. See the one about substance from Patrick. Kevin, although we won't take you first, I'd like you to pick that up, the things about Constitutional Convention, Constituent Assembly. And this is what I want you to come back on. Lots of groups are asking Micheál Martin and the government in the Free State to pick up and start a Constituent Assembly or a convention. I'm wondering, Kevin, why don't United Irelanders like us and the groups in Ireland, why don't we do it ourselves? Why don't we not wait for Micheál Martin and the government and start to figure out what the substance is and work through it without them? Question mark. And the Fraser question about the polls of Brexit being wrong and why don't we just have the poll? Great. Anybody else, anybody who wants to pick that up, please do. I tell you what I really want you to go to, Ruth, if you don't mind, Eugene's question about the hollowing out of middle-class unionism. I find this question fascinating. And even though I didn't like the book, Ruth will know what I'm talking about, The Idea of the Union, which is a book produced by unionists to argue for the union. There's a really interesting section in that book, Ruth, about the fact that middle-class unionists seem to have given up on the idea of the union themselves. They're embarrassed to talk about it, question mark. So I'm fascinated to know what you got to say about that, Ruth. And Bernie's point about national sovereignty being the big $6 million question, bigger than everything else. Is that not really what a border poll would boil down to? We shouldn't dodge history. I absolutely love those questions. Who wants to go first? And try not to answer everything. Who's down to speak first? Just speak out loud, one of the three speakers.
Do you want me to go?
Go on, Kevin.
So yeah, the point about a constitutional convention. I mean, there's a very. I'm fascinated at the kind of the courtliness with which Irish politics is conducted, and the kind of orderliness that they approach referendums. I'm a fan of referendums, I have to say. Brexit notwithstanding, I do quite like the kind of direct democracy approach. But of course, what they try and do in Irish politics is to prefix that with a kind of informed public debate. And of course, any prospect of Sinn Féin entering government in the south is likely to see a constitutional convention established by the Irish government in short order. Frankly, that's if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael don't beat Mary Lou to it. I mean, there's a general greening, I think, of Dublin politics at the moment, and who knows when Micheál Martin is kind of shuffled off the stage later in this year. Leo Varadkar may grab the initiative. Who knows? But yeah, the point is about trying to do this in a kind of orderly, structured, informed way, and of course, we're all for that. But I think what's interesting, just one very quick reflection, that there's kind of three interlocking elements to this. One, and John covered this before, there's got to be demonstrable demand to test the constitutional question in the north, and we can see that perhaps through a clear sequence of opinion polls and or proper election results, which would be my preference. But we are getting closer to that point. We're getting closer to the point in the south where, as I say, the greening of Dublin politics or Sinn Féin entering government will institutionalise a constitutional convention and moves towards Irish unity. In the parlance of eBay, the buyer has got to be willing to collect. And Dublin has been very keen kicking the can down the road, just as British governments have been. But I think what that does then is to send a signal to London and to Westminster, which doesn't have the kind of sense of initiative around these issues. It's parked in a very opaque way in the Good Friday Agreement, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. No disrespect to those post holders, but the idea that a middle-ranking British cabinet minister will ever get to decide unilaterally whether there's a border poll, of course, is nonsense. So what I think is important is if there's demonstrable demand in the north, the institutionalisation of the debate in the south from the Irish government will send a signal to Westminster. And I think Westminster then is willing to do business as long as it is seen to be positioned responding to an Irish initiative. And I think that's the significance of the Constitutional Convention, which I think is, just a matter of a few short years away.
Brilliant, Kevin. I'm about to go to Ruth, but just a wee point, because all three speakers, John and Ruth and Kevin, sometimes we've drifted in from the discussion about a United Ireland to Sinn Féin, as if Sinn Féin just represent United Irelanders. And I just want to say out loud for the audience that United, and I quite like Sinn Féin to nail my colours to the mast. Don't agree with them on every single policy, but generally I do. But United Irelanders come as Sinn Féiners, SDLPers, people before profit, Greens, non-aligned, all sorts of different people, Fianna Fáilers, la-di-da-di-da-da. So we need to sometimes be slightly careful about aligning the two as the same thing. Ruth, on you go.
Well, this constitutional convention wouldn't have any unionists in it, so that's going to give a rather strange impression. I mean, Doug Beattie, who is the most, I think, open and untrammeled by past, really, person, leader of a unionist party, said they found it very unreasonable for anybody to think that as a unionist, he would be helping with the architecture around the argument for a united Ireland by engaging in it. They won't do it. They won't do it. Of course they won't. So what is the point of various aspects of Irish nationalism talking to itself? That isn't going to carry any weight whatsoever in Westminster. I think there are a couple of things I would like to contribute. The hollowing out of unionism. I was very despairing, actually, as somebody who's sympathetic to unionism, about even 10, 15 years ago, about the young people who were leaving. A lot of them were leaving. A lot of them wouldn't go to Queen's anymore because it was such a hostile environment, again, because of young Sinn Féin. It was. But there is a resurgence, if you like. There are young groups of Orange supporters. There are young unionists, and there are also people staying and coming back who wouldn't have done that 10 or 15 years ago, because now Northern Ireland, for instance, is extremely strong in startups, and it's tremendously attractive in some ways to young people who can't afford to get a flat in London, probably can't afford Manchester. And they're suddenly discovering, because of COVID in a way, that there are all these possibilities for being really very comfortably off and prosperous in Northern Ireland. And that, of course, will be a stabilizing factor. And it also involves the advantages for business people, if they want them.
Ruth, do you mind if I stop you there? That was a fair point, Ruth. We're up against the clock. Can I go straight to you, John? And you pick up what you want. There's a couple of questions that haven't been attacked yet, but whatever you want.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's a couple of points. Someone raised a question of, well, okay, with all these conflicting polls, why don't we just have a border poll? I'm a fan of that idea. I think it's a good idea. I've also heard arguments within DUP headquarters for a border poll, calling nationalist bluff. I've heard that from a senior person very close to former DUP leader saying, look, I'd be quite happy with that because it would put it to bed. You could perhaps amend the Good Friday, which says they can have a border poll every 7 years. You could make it perhaps 10 years, get an amendment to that, so you get some stability in the meantime rather than having to have a poll every 7 years. But I think that's quite a good idea. In terms of the question as to whether unionists should engage in discussions about our united Ireland, you see the divisions within unions on that, because Peter Robinson, of course, as was mentioned earlier, did say, look, we should engage. I think that they should engage because you still, in a border poll, if you were a unionist, you'd still simply go and vote against the idea of a united Ireland. So you still have a democratic rejection of the proposition of unity. So in the meantime, it's fine. The unionist argument would be, look, this legitimizes something that we don't want, that we're talking about the dissolution of our own country. We're talking, we're negotiating a surrender process. And I understand that argument, but ultimately, because a discussion about United Ireland isn't going to go away, then there's an argument to engage with it and argue about it. And where I disagree with Kevin, he said, yeah, we could all laugh at Stormont, and I agree, to some extent, it is a comedy show there, but it is potentially, if a United Ireland was to be voted for, then if you haven't got any structures that represent the Protestant British unionist tradition on the island of Ireland, is that a healthy place for unionism to be in? They've still got the border polls safeguard. United Ireland will only come about by democratic consent in the north, and it wouldn't undermine that principle of democratic consent to engage in discussions about what a United Ireland would look like. In the same way that nationalists have to, every day at Stormont, talk about what Northern Ireland looks like because they take part, except when they walk out, but you know, they take part.
John, that's brilliant. John, that's brilliant. I'm excited by the thread and the narrative now. Let's just go for a border. See this image of certain unionists and United Irelanders coming together on a common platform. Let's just have this poll now. So really interesting that that's sort of popped out from some people. Ella, over to you. I hear there's lots more questions and comments. Throw into the pan.
Yeah, so we have a specific question for John, actually, just because we have an expert on the polling in the room. Jason has asked you why, he wants to know why the wording on one of the Liverpool University border polls was phrased it as if there was a border poll tomorrow. He's asking about the word tomorrow. Would you vote for Northern Ireland to be part of the UK? He says that he's a Republican and that even he wouldn't vote for a United Ireland tomorrow. So is there something, you know, in the way that you get, I suppose that's harking back to previous questions about the speed at which change would happen, and would there be transition periods? So he wants to know about
great question.
There are always two questions asked. One asks about how you'd vote in a border poll tomorrow. The second question, though, always asks, what do you think the long-term policy for Northern Ireland should be? So there's a longer-term question as well. So we look at, you know, how it would shape up if there was a border poll tomorrow, but we're also asking, well, longer term, what do you want?
Interesting.
Okay,
Ella, back to you.
Right, that's hope you're satisfied with that, Jason. And then we have a point, sort of half point question from Saoirse, who says that the UK has had very few referendums, but in contrast, in the South, there have been quite a few. And what would be the effect of having? I mean, I don't know that the speakers necessarily want to get into the pro-citizens assembly yes or no question that Kevin raised, but you know, what would, with the infrequency, the difference of the infrequency with that kind of democratic engagement, would that make a difference? And hooked off of that, Bernard has asked whether or not the longer we wait for a border poll will mean it's less likely as a younger generation, you know, I'm talking like, you know, teenagers, 20s, people who are just about coming up to being of voting age or have just started voting, that the distance that they have from the history of the troubles that Ruth has mentioned, but also different historic struggles, would that mean that a United Ireland is less likely because they're disassociated from history? Or how important is history to a younger generation, and that question of national sovereignty? And then there's just one question, which is kind of a bit of a curveball, but I think is interesting. Austin has asked, should we debate reparations by the British government for Irish unity? And he's given the example of Jamaica and India, who, you know, he's talked about a former Indian cabinet minister that said that if the British government paid back the value of £1 a day for the next 200 years, it would solve all of the economic problems in India. And he's asking whether that should be applicable to Ireland. The point he's making is that reparations are not just about apologizing or healing, that it's also about practical questions. So that's linking back in with the economic question. So make what you will out of that.
Ella, that's an interesting wee curveball. Ella, can I ask you a question before I go back to speakers? I'm tempted to make this their final points because I see it's about 8:10.
Yeah.
And if I give them all about maybe, you know, 2 to 3 minutes each to wrap up, is there any burning questions that you want to stick in later, or have you basically hit the key comments and questions already?
There was just one that I was saving for the end, which was from James, who was talking about the fact that, is there a problem with the way in which violence, whether it be unionist violence, whether it be Republican violence, whatever, gets used as a kind of veto in this discussion? That and he's talking particularly about the way this is talked about in Britain, which is that you can hear lots of British politicians when they're asked about Ireland, either the Good Friday Agreement, border poll, whatever it is, clam up because they, not necessarily because of a genuine fear of violence right here and right now, but as a kind of means of shutting down debate. And should there be more openness about what the reality of violence is, but also a kind of an attempt from both sides to refuse to allow that to just veto debate and shut down debate?
Yeah, great. So is the argument for United Ireland almost been pushed to the margins and not allowed to be a normalized conversation because some politicians will say that's going to bring instability and violence and it's against community relations? It's a great last question. Right, now to our three speakers, there's been a few questions on the table. You have to make a judgment call which ones are bits of that you answer, and at the same time weaving in your killer last point to convince the audience why you're right and send them home happy. So Ruth, let me go to you. What do you want to leave us with? You can pick up on some of those questions, or you can say something completely different.
Right. Really, the trouble is that all the questions have been too interesting and distracting almost. There have been so many of them, and it's very frustrating not to be able to get close to them, and most of them. Colm Tóibín wrote about this. He wrote a very interesting book on the border years back, but he also wrote an article recently in which he said, you know, do the South, remember he's a Southerner, do we want to import sectarian hatred and the politics of perpetual grievance from the North into the South? And he said the sort of people in the South, like politicians, who said there will be a united Ireland in my lifetime, that it was mystical blather. He said, but it was the power to unsettle a fragile political environment. And that's what's on my mind all the time. Now, I'm actually in favor of talking about everything. I'm a free speech nut. I'm with Ella on that. But there's no doubt about it that, for instance, when it came to discussing the kind of border we should have, it was the underlying threat of violence from dissidents that caused Theresa May to panic when she should have actually been going for technological solutions as the EU should, to modifications to the land border. But so what I'm saying is, what matters is this fragile political settlement we've got is to nurture it. And you don't nurture it by having constitutional conventions of nationalists, by having groups like Ireland's Future pushing and pushing and pushing. If you want to have discussions with unionists about the future, talk to them about the possibility of Ireland considering going back into the UK. Don't just have the Irish unity things on the agenda. They're not going to join in. Why should they? Think about stability.
And final point, Ruth.
Stability. We have to nurture stability. It is the thing that matters. I don't want to see my country, which is Ireland, with having to face a future in which they are taking in 900,000 odd people who desperately don't want to be there. It's going to be the North of the last decades, only worse. Why would we do that? It is not what people do not want instability.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And Kevin, over to yourself.
Thanks, Kevin. Just to probably pick up on a couple of points there that Ruth made as well. I mean, we can't have the politics of the unionist veto. Those days are gone. Those days are gone. The Good Friday Agreement is, you know, a spit and shake agreement where everybody had to concede something pretty major. But within that is the proviso for a border poll and a change in Northern Ireland's constitutional status. And of course, Britain is not sanguine about sovereignty in any other context like it is with Northern Ireland. So when I talk about British indifference, I mean, it's not a trivial point, it's a fundamental point. Britain placed Northern Ireland in an antechamber in 1998, and there is one door that leads out onto Irish unity, and eventually we will get to that point. And this is what I mean by inevitability. We have the framework that delivers Irish unity. It's not an aspirational thing. It's actually hardwired into a treaty and into the government policy of the United Kingdom. So we can't have the politics of the unionist veto or the threats of loyalist violence, which, you know, which of course is how Northern Ireland came about in the first place and has retarded political developments all the way along, much frankly to unionists' own detriment. You know, as we've seen, if they'd have agreed to Sunningdale and not brought that down in 1974, then we could have averted most of the troubles, and Northern Ireland may have had a half decent chance. Those days are gone. Northern Ireland as a concept is bankrupt. It's gone. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as a society. Excuse me. It doesn't work as an economy reliant on a 10 billion subvention, and it doesn't work as a political system. It's a broken politics, a clapped out economy, and a divided society. We have to produce something better. Now, the agreement that we came to in the Good Friday Agreement is there can be Irish unity when there is support when certain caveats are met. Well, that is the nature of the debate. That's the only debate in town. It's the only interesting thing, the only interesting political discussion that takes place in Northern Ireland, frankly. But we are capable of something that is so much better. The incorporation of the economic policy framework of the Irish Republic into Northern Ireland would generate hundreds of thousands of jobs, enormous wealth and opportunity. And I think ultimately that's where this debate crystallizes. There is something better than what we've got at the moment, which doesn't work.
Evan, thank you very, very much. That was a great final ending. And on to yourself, John, last but not least. And okay. Just before you kick off, John, just instinctively and intuitively, not scientifically, Kevin's earlier point about it has to pass the common sense test. What do you think about that point? I'm interested. Has Kevin got a point there about instinct and intuition? And I'm fascinated by the people who are messaging in or asking questions about how the polls were wrong previously, etc. What do you think about that?
Well, we won't really know how accurate the polls are until we have a border poll, which is one of the reasons that I would like public opinion to be formally tested, as I said earlier. I mean, things have changed. When I was growing up, and throughout my upbringing, nationalists were very much the underdogs. These days, it's actually unionists that are the underdogs within Northern Ireland, no question about it. And having worked with unionist parties, they're too often casually dismissed as sectarian bigots. Now, in terms of the future, where unionism goes, it's very, very difficult because there is a dilemma within unionism as to whether to engage in any discussion on Irish unity. The difficulty of confronting unionism is that the rules of the game now, whilst they are to some extent, they were weighted in their favour in 1998 by the demographics of 1998. Those demographics are not the same in 2022, and they're likely to get worse for unionism. The risk for unionism is that come border poll day, which will arrive one day, that they are outvoted by a combination of nationalists and that big swathe of society that we haven't talked about enough tonight, the others, the non-voters, but who will turn out in a referendum and who will make their mind up, not on the basis of the tricolour or the Union flag or loyalty to the Queen or loyalty to President Higgins or anything. Those who are genuinely undecided, they're a big swathe now of Northern Irish society. Some of them go out and vote for Alliance or the Greens or whatever. A lot of them don't vote. Those are the people who could yet turn a border poll in nationalism's favour. And that would leave unionism on the sidelines. And I think that's the risk for unionism, even though I understand, if it was a unionist member of the DUP, I would be reluctant to engage in constitutional discussion. But that constitutional discussion isn't going to go away. And that's where I finished tonight.
John, brilliant. Can I just say a couple of quick things, a couple of final points from me to everyone. First of all, John and Kevin and Ruth, thank you very much. There's a lot of disagreement there. We can only skim the surface, and I'm putting you under time pressures, but thanks a million for agreeing to speak. And it's not as if you get a fear or anything, so thanks a million for that. Really enjoyed it. Can I say, secondly, a reminder to everybody who's listening that Saturday's debate, Ireland's Future debate, is online for people at 1 o'clock on Saturday if you want to tune into that. Details from Ireland's Future website. And just in terms of irishborderpoll.com, my final 2 or 3 sentences, guys, please hit the subscribe button. And that means we'll send you out occasional little emails about what we're up to and what's coming up. One of the things we're hoping to do is in early March, a little bit before St. Patrick's Day, is have a major event at Portcullis House. And Portcullis House is just across the road from Westminster Parliament in central London, where we're hopefully going to get some of the major parties from Ireland over and try and have a discussion about how do we build for Irish unity amongst people in Britain, ? More details of that to come. So if you've subscribed, I'll let you know about that. Other than that, I also want to thank a fella who's behind the scenes called Harley, who's been pressing the buttons and making sure everything went smoothly. And of course, I want to thank Ella. And sorry if we didn't get through any of your questions or comments, guys, but the way I see it is we're only scratching the surface of this United Ireland debate. And as we go along, hopefully we'll get much more professional, refined. And thanks for tuning in. I'm going to let the very last word go to you, Ella, in case there's anything you want to say by way of goodbye and thanks.
Yes, thank you, Kevin, and thanks everyone. Really, I read out just a fraction of the comments and questions that came in to us. So it shows that people wanted to engage in this debate, and therefore, if you want to continue coming to other Irish Border Poll events, I've put the website in the link there, but it really is irishborderpoll.com. And if you go on there, then you can subscribe. You can find out where the next events are going to be, the one in Portcullis House potentially that Kevin mentioned, but also online events. And just send us an email if you want to suggest future debates, if you want to get involved, any of that. Kevin's willing for anybody to come in and get involved and help with us. So irishborderpoll.com, follow us on YouTube, share it with your friends. And thanks everyone for a really interesting debate. Thanks to the speakers, and good night.
Thanks a million, guys. Good night.